I'm chairing the meeting. We're going to we are recording the workshop. Just a spot of housekeeping. I understand that there is IT are doing some upgrades tonight, and I believe you've all been told to come off your VPNs and just go through your normal servers. So, but if for any reason the workshop does fail halfway through due to at 6 o'clock due to that, then obviously we will rerun the workshop again. But I'm hoping that won't be the case, and we'll be able to continue as normal. So there's two introductions to start off with tonight. First of all, Councillor Harvey will help set the scene, together with Flo Churchill, the new interim service director, as well. We've got two workshops for you to go into as we move forward, as you would have seen on the agenda, and there will be time for questions, etc., within those workshops as well. So straight over to Councillor Harvey.
Great, and I'd like to say thank you to officers for preparing this briefing. It's really important that you as ward members get clarity on what's being asked at this point in the update process. I'm sure your parishes will be interested, and hopefully you'll be able to help explain any queries or questions that they've got. And I'd like to thank you all as members for attending and taking an interest. This is the first major consultation in the update process, and it's about the big handful options for how development comes forward in Herefordshire, and what changes we need to make to the way that we plan for that to happen, both to reflect the learning that we've had over the last 6 years since the core strategy was adopted, because not everything's gone according to plan. And we need to learn from that and maybe understand why and how we take account of that in what we do next, and in pushing the timeframe of the plan out 10 years. But also because it's really going to shape the more detailed policy work that follows on from it. So getting this top level wireframe right in terms of how we develop in our urban areas, how we develop in our rural areas, and understanding what the consequences are of those choices, positive and negative, I think will be really important. So thanks for taking part, and do encourage your parishes to come along to the parish session tomorrow night if they're able. I've asked officers to look at whether we can arrange another session for parishes later on in the consultation window on a different day of the week. And hopefully we can sweep up parishes that weren't able to come to this one in time for them to be able to respond in a cogent manner. So thank you very much, and hand over to Flo.
Thank you, Councillor Harvey. We are in interesting times in planning at the moment. Unfortunately, the Levelling Up bill doesn't seem to have dealt with planning much as an issue, but that's the caveat that we have to issue before we talk about anything else this evening. We are briefing you on this according to the rules and regulations as they stand at the moment. We don't know when they're going to change and how they're going to change. But the really important thing, as Councillor Harvey said, is that this event is the first real chance for you as members to engage in this local plan process. We have started an initial local plan consultation on the 17th of January on these a series of high-level spatial options. But today's workshop provides a chance to find out more about those options, and for you to provide us with some initial feedback regarding the advantages and disadvantages of the published options. When we're talking about the options and you have a question to ask, please use the chat facility, and we will try and answer your questions tonight. If we can't, we will get back to you with a written answer. But this evening's session is going to begin with a 20-minute presentation setting out a number of the spatial options, and that's going to be delivered by Carla and by Stuart this evening. Following the presentation, members will then be divided into breakout groups, firstly to consider aspects of the county-wide options, before being asked to report back on the discussion. So we will ask you in your groups to elect somebody to report back. Then there'll be a second workshop to consider the implications of the spatial options for the rural parts of the county, followed again by a reporting session. Each workshop group will have a facilitator, and there will be other officers available to help with discussions, and I and some of the other officers are going to pop in and out of these groups. If you need me to come in, or then just ask. The event will end with the details of the next step in the plan making process. The other thing to bear in mind is that this is going to be recorded and will be available on the council website. So handing back to my planning colleagues to take us forward.
So Carla, you're taking us through the first workshop?
Stuart will.
Yes,
Stuart,
yes.
sorry.
Might me first. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, good evening all. As part of the spatial options consultation, we have outlined 5 broad options for the pattern and scale of new housing development for Herefordshire in the 2021 to 2041 plan period. This consultation is focused on how to accommodate housing across Herefordshire. The other important issues, such as employment land and provision of infrastructure and services, will be addressed at a later stage. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so the amount of housing growth that's required over the next plan period has been taken from the government standard method, which determines how many dwellings need to be delivered every year. The standard method indicates 850 dwellings per year for Herefordshire, or 17,000 over the next 20. The spatial options also take into account an existing planning permissions for 5,800 units. Therefore, we're looking for a residual figure of around 11,000 to accommodate. Further information on the county's housing need can be found in the Herefordshire Housing Market and Needs Assessment, or HMNR abbreviated, which was published in July last year. As well as housing requirements, other issues also had to be considered. The local plan will be closely integrated to the Hereford Transport Strategy Review, and the local transport plan will be updated within the next 18 months. Further work will be required to review the impact of transport in regards to the options within this consultation. This consultation is also based on the understanding that the current restrictions of development in the local catchment will be resolved at an early stage of the updated plan period. These options show the way that development can be distributed, and each option takes different approaches over this. Each of the following slides will display a map that includes sort of rounded up figures for Hereford, market towns and the rural areas. And it also will display a map which shows the scale of developments under each option to low, medium or high growth option. This is proportionate in the sense that what is considered a high level of growth for Kingdom, for example, may be a low level of growth for Hereford. This will now be discussed in more detail. The next slide, please. Okay, so option 1 is the housing need baseline option. This is based completely on the market demands that are identified in the recently published housing market needs assessment aforementioned. The purpose of the study is to provide robust evidence of the levels of housing needs across Herefordshire's 7 housing market areas. This would, broadly speaking, represent a continuation of a strategy similar to that in the existing core strategy, resulting in sustained development in the larger market towns, Hereford and the rural areas respectively. With regards to the market towns, their role as thriving service centres will continue to be emphasised. Brombyard and Kington would experience more moderate development due to their smaller size. Ledbury is also identified for limited growth, as it has already met its housing targets with existing permissions with this distribution strategy. It would need to be ensured that the market towns can accommodate the proposed level of growth within their environmental constraints whilst maintaining their distinctiveness. In Hereford, a transport assessment will be required to determine whether it can continue to accommodate the level of growth proposed in light of changes to the transport strategy for the city. The highest proportion of identified need is in the rural areas compared with Hereford City and the market towns, as can be seen here. Trends in housing delivery in the rural areas have been strong, so similar levels of development to those currently would likely continue to be experienced here. It is still important to note that various options for distribution of the rural portion of the growth will be set out in the second session. The rural share of the development could mean a broader distribution of growth with a more localized focus on meeting housing need, and could have a role to play in the delivery of rural affordable housing. However, spreading development more thinly in this way could result in limited individual benefits, i.e. the delivery of key infrastructure facilities that could be sourced from larger developments. It could also lead to county-wide increases in traffic levels. The next slide, please. Option 2 focuses on market towns and rural-based growth. This option would disperse growth across the county's 5 market towns and rural areas, while significantly lowering the housing requirements in Hereford City. This could afford more flexibility as the city's transport strategy evolves, following the determination not to proceed with the South Wye and Hereford transport packages in the existing core strategy. This option could potentially increase more affordable housing and infrastructure in both the market towns and rural areas, helping to address perceived imbalances between Hereford City and these areas in this regard. The distribution of portions to each market town would be determined by their individual constraints, site availability, and their suitability for development at these locations. As mentioned in the last option, the distribution for the rural portion will be determined separately, the options for which will be set out later on. As regards to Hereford, this would deliver significantly less than the requirement identified in the housing market needs assessment, and could weaken the city's ability to attain affordable housing and infrastructure. Though conversely, it could reduce pressure on the city's existing infrastructure and services. It could also reduce the reliance on larger urban extensions like those in the existing strategy, for which delivery trends have not been reliable. It would also take account of Hereford's environmental constraints, such as areas that are prone to flooding and the phosphate levels in the River Wye. Could I have the next slide, please? Option 3 is to focus growth across the market towns and Hereford. This option would focus greater growth across the county's market towns and Hereford. The result would be a significant uplift in growth levels for the market towns, with a smaller one for Hereford, and a significant decrease in the rural areas when compared with option 1. This would direct development to areas that can support and enhance existing services, infrastructure, and businesses, albeit with some of these likely requiring expansion. Broadly speaking, it is consistent with the settlement hierarchy for the county as a whole, and would support the overall principle of sustainable development. Conversely, this option could lead to a stagnation of the age structure in the county's rural villages, with a reduction in housing stock that would otherwise help to retain the younger population. Also, restraining developments in these areas could also mean that some villages struggle to retain their existing services. As with option 1, distribution would need to ensure that the market towns could accommodate this uplifting growth within their constraints and without losing their local distinctiveness. By placing an emphasis on larger urban expansion sites, there could be potential to attain higher levels of affordable housing and deliver more planned, sustainable, better connected patterns of development. But historic low levels of delivery must also be noted here. The next slide, please. Thank you. Option 4 is for focusing on a single market town to deliver growth. This option would see one of the county's larger market towns, namely either Ledbury, Ross, or Leominster, be made a focus for growth. The result of this will be one of these 3 towns having an approximate growth target of 2,000 new dwellings. And just to clarify what you can see on the slide here, this is showing an example sub-option if Leominster to be carried forward with this option. Hereford City would have a growth target of 4,000, with the rural areas having a significantly reduced target compared with the existing core strategy, which would total around 3,300. The 3 candidate towns that have been chosen were based on their existing role as service centres and potential capacity to accommodate such a level of growth. Determining which of these would be best placed to take the growth will be subject to more detailed assessment of land availability and suitability in each of the towns. You may note that Bromyard and Kington have not been included as candidates here. This is because of their constraints development owing to their smaller capacity for development and smaller provision of service and infrastructure owing to their sizes. Can I have the next slide, please? Finally, option 5 proposes a new rural settlement with growth focused in Leominster and Bromyard. This option proposes one or more new settlements located in a rural area of the county, which could deliver over a third of the rural housing growth target if carried forward. Using a baseline for 1,500 dwelling new settlements as an example, were this to be delivered, Leominster and Bromyard would see proportionate large-scale growth with more moderate targets in Hereford and Ross. The remainder of the targets will be distributed across existing rural settlements. The new settlement in question would need to be in a location that is well connected physically, economically, and socially with existing settlements. Whilst there would need to be service provision that allows for some degree of self-sufficiency, the settlement should not be too isolated. Neither must it have a detrimental effect on the viability and vitality of existing centres by diverting economic activity away from them. The settlement should be accessible by sustainable modes of transport, either located on a rail route or somewhere that can be easily served by bus services. To carry this option forward and for it to deliver on the objectives of it, there would need to be a number of requirements met. Firstly, the settlement would need to be an appropriate size that can support new services that a new community would create a requirement for. So taking again that baseline figure, a 1,500 dwelling settlement could support a new primary school and a local centre. Therefore, a large assembly of appropriate land for development would need to be made available and in an area that would not cause damage to local ecology, landscape, historic value, or future climate resilience. If possible, use should be made of brownfield land, though it is also acknowledged that this will be challenging in the rural areas of Herefordshire. It also should be made clear that this will be a lengthy process. Delivering new settlements requires comprehensive master planning and have long lead-in times. Therefore, delivery would likely be towards the latter end of the new plan period. A 1,500 dwelling settlement would likely average around 150 dwellings per annum. This brings us to the end of the spatial options part of the presentation. I'll now hand over to Carla, who will discuss the rural options in more detail.
Thanks, Stuart. So in this section, I'm going to talk about the rural spatial options. As you saw in the previous slides, there are varying levels of growth for each strategic option, as shown in the pie charts and overall figures in the tables. This varies across the board from city, town, and rural areas. So the outcome for the rural options will be influenced by the strategic option choices. Likewise, what you might see in the rural option may determine what your preferred strategic option is. These two sets of options are codependent of one another. Next slide, please. So at this stage, it is undecided what the amount of rural growth areas will need to accommodate, but we expect that they could accommodate up to 6,500 dwellings. And it could be less than this, depending on what strategic option we proceed with. The process chart on the slide shows how the evidence base will feed and inform rural strategy and policies right up to the adoption of the local plan. The parish questionnaire, which was sent out before Christmas, has just finished consultation, and we will be looking at the responses received. Work is underway on the rural areas background paper and settlement hierarchy. This is our evidence base to inform the strategy for development here. The review looks at current services, infrastructure, environmental constraints, accessibility. This will help determine the list of settlements which would be able to accommodate some growth. We anticipate consulting on this paper later in spring. So this means we will be able to analyse the results going into summer and further develop the rural areas policies ready for a draft plan. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, that one. So this is an overall summary of the rural areas options. This slide illustrates the 4 strategic options considered for distributing rural housing growth. There will be more detail on each option after this slide. So option 1, the dispersed approach, reflects the current strategy of dispersed housing growth in settlements. You can see from the pie chart that there are many pieces in this one, and each piece represents a settlement. So many settlements would be identified in this option. And option 2, this is housing growth in the larger settlements. The larger settlements will see more growth than the dispersal strategy. Larger proportionate growth would be accommodated in each of the identified settlements. So fewer settlements, which you can see represented in the pie chart. And option 3, this would be housing growth in the rural hubs. This will further reduce the list of settlements where growth can happen. This means more significant growth in each settlement. So a limited number of large settlements will cater for more growth. And option 4 is housing growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas. This would mean focusing development in settlements outside designated areas with limited growth in the areas in the A and B and conservation area. Next slide, please. So more detail for rural areas option 1, this dispersal approach. This option is similar to the current rural distribution in the core strategy. This is a dispersed approach across a greater number of settlements. This means less growth in the larger amount of settlements. Settlements will be selected following our results from the reviewed settlement hierarchy and background evidence paper. Possible outcomes for this option would be retention of existing services in the settlements and continuation of proportionate growth with a focus on key services which have a good level of accessibility and taking into account environmental constraints. The downside is, with this option, it provides minimal opportunities for affordable housing in villages, as small sites will not deliver this. And also it's more difficult sustainability-wise for dispersed growth to initiate active travels. And next slide, please. So option 2, this is growth in the larger settlements. The purpose of this option is to focus on fewer settlements than in option 1. So it would be moving away from the current strategy of wide dispersal to a more limiting strategy across a reduced number of rural settlements. This rural option will see higher proportion of growth in and around the identified number of settlements considered suitable for growth. These settlements are likely to have a reasonable level of accessibility, services and facilities within adequate transport links. It should provide a better range of housing to meet wider needs, including the ageing population, but this will require further detail. It could help to facilitate investment in infrastructure such as schools, health facilities and open spaces. Provision of sustainable transport is more likely to be achieved. It also can help sustain current village services and potentially enhance these. And if we go on to the next slide, thank you. Rural areas option 3 is growth in the rural hubs. Under this option, all rural growth is focused at a small number of key settlements. Of all of the options, this would have the least amount of settlements identified. This would result in more dwellings at each hub location. It is anticipated that those identified would have good levels of public transport links with a wider availability of services and less environmental effects. Concentration of growth in these hubs would mean other settlements would have a reduced number of growth and could be more limiting. The impact of these levels of growth on a settlement could be relatively significant. This will be subject to further work, including with the parish councils, to derive the most appropriate approach and assess the suitability of potential sites through our housing land assessment, which is currently underway. This option would require larger scale greenfield development on the edge of settlements because there is limited brownfield land supply in the rural areas. There will be greater environmental issues for this, so it needs to take into account more development concentrated on fewer places to meet the rural growth target. There's opportunities for placemaking are increased to incorporate additional facilities such as open space, green infrastructure, community facilities, for example, as well as affordable housing. There is also much to consider with schools and how these will be affected by the increased populations. If we go on to our next slide. Thank you. So the rural areas, option 4, this is growth outside areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas. So this option reflects a proposal set out in the planning white paper published in 2020, where AONBs and conservation areas were identified as needing more protection. So to give you a bit of context, Herefordshire has 40 conservation areas and 2 AONBs. So that's sort of the background context for that. Outcomes for this option will mean large settlements outside AONBs and conservation areas may receive a greater proportion of growth. It will help to sustain such village service centres, create affordable housing, sustainable travel. On the plus side, limited growth in these designated areas may assist in protecting and enhancing the natural and built environment in those areas. However, some of these large settlements that contain many key services are reasonably accessible. Restricting growth here could have negative effects in such areas. I mean, at this stage, we do not know if central government will continue this approach through planning guidance and legislation, but this will be determined in the future. So in summary, option 1 will be a wide dispersal over many settlements. Option 2 and 3, the list of settlements will get smaller, but the level of growth per settlement will increase. And option 4 will limit growth within the AONB and conservation areas, concentrating growth outside these areas. So thank you for that. We'll now open the floor up to questions, and for either section of the presentation, if you've got questions, please raise your hand.
Can we take the presentation down, please? Thank you. And we'll be going into workshops shortly, where a lot of there'll be set questions for you to answer, and we'll all then come back, and there will be discussions which will be facilitated by each facilitator from each group. Have we got any questions, burning questions now that members want to ask?
You caveated it by burning. I'm not sure it's burning. Maybe we, but I will take the chance now that I'm here. Can I just wonder? I just wondered why in the first option, why Kington was identified as a low volume. What are the constraints around Kington that mean it's not identified as having in any of the options really much growth?
So Kevin's going to come forward with that.
Yeah, I think it's largely because of its size and range of services and facilities and its position. So the option 1, which was based effectively on the housing market and needs assessment work that was done last year, basically looked at sort of past trends and demographic change over the next 20 years. So that was based on what happened in the past, and over really the last 40 years. Kington's averaged sort of around 10 houses a year. That's been the rate of development in the town, and there are physical constraints around the town, which probably means it's not suitable for significant growth.
Thanks, Kevin. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, mine's not really a question, Kevin, but it's really a statement, and I can leave it to later. I think for me, my concern is that developers actually redefine hamlets as villages in order to get their applications through. And unfortunately, that can have a huge impact in changing the actual landscapes in the AONB areas. And that is happening in my ward, and I'm really concerned about it. So I think that having a density, a rural density on per footprint per hectare is essential for rural areas, because we're getting urban housing in rural communities. And yeah, I'll leave the other points to later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Swinglehurst.
Hello. Yeah, a couple of things. I'm curious as to why phosphate in the river was only mentioned as a concern regarding numbers of houses in Hereford, when it's obviously an issue elsewhere, and presumably there's some triangulation between this and the works being done by Dirk Cymru and the sewage treatment works, because there are technical solutions to sewage where we're struggling with agricultural diffuse. So it just seems to me that actually affects everything. And indeed, there's a question mark over the lower Y water quality as well. And similarly, a concern about whether or not numbers of houses going into market towns would alter the character of the market towns, but not a parallel concern over whether the number of houses historically, I think, oversupplying in the rural villages has not impacted the character of the rural villages.
And I think a lot of that information will come out as part of the consultation process that we're running through.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Marsh.
Yeah, I would like to, yes, reiterate Jeremy's point, really, that the 5,800 is a third of all the ones that are proposed. So it's a considerable volume, and it would be enormously helpful to have some more information about where they are and how likely they are to be built as we make this important decision about the remaining 2/3. So some summary information about that would be enormously helpful.
Kevin, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think as I said in the chat, they are set out in our 5 years, but they make the bulk of our 5-year housing land supply. So they are set out in that paper and listed. All those sites are listed in there with the distribute, how they fall within our housing market areas and so on. So they are there. If you,
right, that's all the hands down for now.
Councillor Marsh
Oh, sorry.
I think she was on
Sorry.
mute. So.
Yes, no, I will try and find them in this appendix wherever it is.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we can help you with that, Councillor.
Yeah, I did put the link in the chat. So
okay, so let's move into our first workshop then. So Sam Banks will take us through into is it two workshops, two separate workshops? Is it, Sam? We're going to move to.
Yeah, we've got a breakout, so 3 breakout rooms, and to discuss the spatial growth and the spatial options 1 to 5 that Stuart outlined first of all. Then we'll all come back for group feedback, and then we'll go back out for the second workshop, which is about the rural areas that Carla did the presentation on. And there'll be set questions in there. There'll be a facilitator in each of those rooms for you. So I'll just send you into the breakout rooms now.
Just briefly, just if members could select someone to do the presentation back to the when we all come back together, and that will be very useful. If you do that first of all, so that member can report back. Thank you.